There we go. And we are live! Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The Bigger Picture! Yay. Joining us live on Zoom is a wonderful virtual studio audience. Not limited to just the UK, we should add. We've got people tuning in from all over the world, including Crete. So here we go, guys. We are on week 2 at our finale of Parashat Vayeitze. So we're going to get our slides up on the screen over here and get ourselves started with what promises to be, as always, a fantastic, fantastic session. So everyone can see me, everyone can hear me. I've had positive feedback from at least one person on the slides. So we are keeping with the same format. And let's delve in to week 2, building and destroying the Jewish people. Let's see what we are going to cover in tonight's session. But before we do that, let's just briefly review on things that we were talking about last week. So we had mentioned that Parashat Vayeitze is quite unique in that it doesn't have any breaks. It doesn't have any paragraph breaks, which means that we just have one theme that we are considering with Parashat Vayeitze. And we started looking into that last week. And that one theme was Vayeitze, Yaakov going out. He was having to flee from his family home and he has to go out. And we talked about a little bit last week and touched upon it previously when we were doing Parashat Toldot, that he was going out to Galut. He was going out into his exile and he was going there in order to fulfill his goals. And we've connected that in the past to the fact that any time that we are going through a period of Galut, it is because we have something that we need to work on, something that we need to identify, something that needs to be fine-tuned. So this is what is going on with Yaakov Avinu. There is a purpose to him having to go out. And several things happen on account of him having to go out. As we see in Parashat Vayeitze, he has the encounter with the holy place, with the house of God, in which he goes to sleep, and he has this dream with the ladder rooted in the ground, stretching all the way up to Shamayim, and the angels going up and down. And we talked about spirituality and physicality and the fact that we have things moving in between them. We talked about how Yaakov represents that on a human scale. As humans, we are partially spiritual, we are partially physical, and we have messages going between the two parts of our existence. And in so doing, that gives us our reason for existence, to be able to channel what we need to channel into our spiritual progress and into our spiritual growth. We talked about how the ladder between Shamayim and Aretz, between the heavens and the land, is a macrocosm of what we have in our own physical bodies. We have our heads, which are machshava, which are the point of thought, of spiritual origin. It's connected to our physical body by our spine. We talked about how Yaakov represents the spine, the torso of the human body, and he therefore is bridging and harmonizing and bringing to completion the physical aspect of ourselves and the spiritual aspect of ourselves. We called him an ish shalem, a complete person. When he comes back from this galut, when he comes back from this exile, he comes back a completed person. He learns how to harmonize all of these different facets, which really then paves the way for us in our own ways and in our own lives to learn to bridge that gap between the physical and the spiritual. That's some of the things that we were covering in last week's session. So let's take it up a notch, guys. And in so doing, we need to focus on one element, one object that appears multiple times in Parashat Vayeitze, crops up a few times. And I don't know if anyone wants to try and hazard a guess as to what that object is. It's not the ladder. There's something else that crops up a few different times and in a few different ways in the parasha. Stone. Who said that? Gary and Sunny Bushy. Well done. That's right. Let's take a look at the way in which stones, avanim, make their way into this important parasha and what we learn from Avanim, from the stones. So we know that when Yaakov encounters the holy place, that he arranges 12 stones around his head. So we know that it comes up across there, but it comes up in some other places in the parasha. Anybody want to show off their wisdom and their knowledge? I can see some of you cycling through the text over there. That's great. I can see some of you just going through the mental processes of picturing where it comes up in the parasha. Who's going to throw out a suggestion? Who's going to throw out an answer? There's going to be 2 more instances in which we encounter stones in Parashat Vayeitze. The first one comes a short while after he finishes his nighttime dream. He wakes up, he moves on, and he heads over to his uncle's house. And as he approaches the place where his uncle lives, he comes across a well which has a stone covering over it. And so there's the episode there where he has to remove the stone from the well. This is the moment where he encounters and meets Rachel. So this is another occasion where Yaakov in this Parashat Vayeitze encounters a stone. And the final place, the final part of the parasha.
Well, scrolling through, I find near the end,
the
Reuben and Yaakov, the whole, here is a cairn, here also the memorial stone, which I set up between myself and yourself. So Laban is setting up a boundary.
Excellent. So towards the end of the parasha, there's another occasion, there's a treaty, really, which Lavan and Yaakov enter into, a monument that is created. It has 2 different names. Lavan calls it by an Aramaic name, Yagar Sahaduta, and Yaakov calls it Galed, or Galed, basically. And so that's interesting. Avanim come up again over there, and when you add into the fact that the mound of stones that they create is known as a gal, known as this mound, you can see just how often stone-related imagery is entering into Parashat Vayeitze. There has to be a reason. There has to be something that it is teaching us. Why is the concept of an even, why is the concept of a stone so important? So in order to understand that, we have to also understand the massive shift that is taking place in Parashat Vayeitze. You see, for the first half of the book of Bereshit, Noach, Lech Lecha Vayera Chayesara, told off and into Vayeitze as well, we have been talking constantly about how we are busy searching our way throughout history, sifting through the sands of time until we eventually encountered the pearl that is Abraham, sifting through again between Yitzchak and Yishmael to be able to get to Yitzchak, sifting through again between Yaakov and Esav to be able to get to Yaakov. That all started with the Garden of Eden. It selected away right the way through, all through those generations until we reach Yaakov. And when we reach Yaakov, there are now no longer any elements that need to be selected out. Because what happens is he gives birth to 12 descendants, and all of those descendants will become part of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people. So if you recall the term that we've used in the past of Ma'aseh Avot, Siman Labanim, the actions of the father or the actions of the prototype being an indicator for how things will progress as history will develop. So Yaakov is very much the prototype of Klal Yisrael. And that is the whole first half of the book of Bereshit. And for the second half, from here till the end of Bereshit, we enter into a second phase. And that second phase focuses on Yaakov spreading out. Not just Yaakov, but his name turns into something else. His name is also... See, nodding heads, but go on. Someone be brave.
Yisrael.
Thank you very much. So Yaakov / Yisrael spread out into the components that are going to make up Klal Yisrael. So both for our Sefer, it's for our book of Bereshit, it's entering into what the klal is going to be comprised of, what the nation is going to be comprised of. And when we reach the end of the book of Bereshit, we now have Yaakov with 12 descendants ready, entering into the land of Egypt. And once we get into the book of Shemot, once we get into the next book, the book of Exodus, that is literally the book in which we give birth to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people, to the Jewish nation. So the rest of this book of Bereshit is forming, is focusing on the component parts of the Jewish people. We see at the end of Shemot this really coming into being solidified in a way, right? The final verse of the book of Shemot, which talks about the Mishkan, the tabernacle being constructed. Ki anan Hashem al ha-Mishkan. The cloud of Hashem would be on the Mishkan, Yomam by day, ve'esh tehiyeh layla bo, le'inei kol Beit Yisrael, b'chol masehem. The whole book is setting out to accomplish the reality of Bnei Yisrael, or of Beit Yisrael, the house of Israel. And what a house is made of, people? They're made of bricks, or they're made of stones. So the avanim, the stones that are creating Beit Yisrael, right, the component parts that are making Beit Yisrael in Sefer Shemot are already being formed in Sefer Bereshit. Vayeitze is the midpoint of the 12 building blocks. There's 12 parashiyot in the book of Bereshit. We're building up the Klal Yisrael. And so the parsha that produces these building blocks, it should only be natural then that it's so closely connected to the images of Avanim. But why? What are Avanim trying to teach us? What is this imagery? Why this imagery? So to understand that, we can have a look at a verse in which we are described. We as a people are described in the context of Avanim. At the end of the book of Bereshit, Yaakov gives a bracha, a blessing to Yosef. And in that verse, chapter 49, verse 24, in the context of Yosef's interaction with Potiphar and holding himself back when he was living in the home of Potiphar and the situations that he had to face with Potiphar's wife, the pasuk there refers to us as Even Yisrael. Vateshev be'itan kashto ve'afoz Yisrael yadav midei avir Yaakov misham ro'eh Even Yisrael. And what's fascinating is that Rashi picks up on the translation, the Aramaic translation of this verse. He picks up on this word Even. What is Even denoting? What is it teaching us? What theme is it teaching us? You see, Onkelos picks up on this verse and translates it as follows, and Rashi picks up on the translation that Onkelos gives us in Aramaic. Onkelos says that Even is really a contraction of the words Avahan Uvanim, the fathers and the children. So says Rashi, Lashon Notrikon, Av Ubein. The word Even is an abbreviation, it's contraction of Av and Ben, father and sons. And so when we have this word Even, it's in the context of Jacob and his sons. It's in the context of a father-son relationship. Now, why? Why do we need to know this? Why is Even constructed in this way? What is it trying to teach us? Is this just some kind of word game, right? Is this just a cute little vort, a cute little Devar Torah that Rashi is trying to tell us? Or is there something much deeper going on? Is there something very deep and linked between an Even, between a stone and people, a father and child relationship? What is so special about stones and rocks? Well, stones and rocks are very, let's see what my slides say, long-lasting. Stones and rocks are very long-lasting. Stones and rocks are very strong. Stones and rocks are very solid. They have a sense of eternity and continuity to them. So this already is going to start helping us understand why stones need to play such an important part in this bridge, right? This bridge between Yaakov and the component parts of the Bnei Yisrael, between the Av of Yaakov and the Ben of the 12 children of the 12 components of the Jewish people. But it does go very, very deep. You see, it's not just the fact that stones as physical entities are strong and solid and long-lasting, but they also have a connection to the human body, the parts of us which are strong and long-lasting and solid. And what are those parts? It's our bones. You see, after... Okay, didn't know I was going to say that. Our bones are the most similar parts of our body to the long-lasting stones. After our flesh disintegrates, our bones still remain. What is the Hebrew word for bones? Anyone know? The Hebrew word for bones are atzamot, right? And what's the Hebrew word for essence? The Hebrew word for essence is an etzem. So our bones, our link to the world of stones, expresses our essence, expresses the essence, the most continuous and eternal part of ourselves, right? And perhaps this is why we put stones on grave sites, because it's the essence of a person that remains the most eternal, and that can be signified and that can be best conveyed through the imagery of a stone. But nonetheless, let's kind of zoom back out a little bit. We've got Yaakov on his way. Vayeitze, he's gone out. He's on his way to build the building blocks of Klal Yisrael, to build the building blocks of the Jewish people. And he is creating Av and Ben relationships, father-child relationships that will produce the 12 tribes. And 11 of the 12 tribes are born in this parasha. Now, these are not just 12 kids. These are not just 12 names. These are 12 tribes. These are 12 foundations. These are 12 building blocks. The names of these tribes outlive the individual people, right? The individuals may come and go, but the tribe of Reuven lasts forever. The tribe of Levi lasts forever. The tribe of Shimon lasts forever. So these are all pieces of a klal. These are all pieces of an entity which are bigger than the individual. They are the avanim. They are the stones, the foundational stones, the prototypes, as it were, of the Jewish people. And that is the overlap between Av and Ben, and coming together in this form of the Even. You know, it's touching on this concept of creating an eternal entity. There is a fascinating Gemara. There is a fascinating source in the Masechet Ta'anit, which says as follows. It talks about a meal that took place between Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Nachman, and they quote Rabbi Yochanan, who says as follows: Yaakov Avinu lo met. Yaakov never died. Isn't that a fascinating thing to say? Yaakov Avinu never died, despite the fact that we talk about him being eulogized and mourned, despite the fact that he was embalmed, despite the fact that he was taken off for burial. Nonetheless, we have a Gemara over here. We have a source in Chazal which is telling us that Yaakov never died. Perhaps the reason is because there is a certain level of eternity to him. Because if his descendants are alive, then he is alive. Yaakov, Yisrael, as a prototype for all of Klal Yisrael, is linked to the eternity of the Jewish nation. If we think about it as well, when we've talked about when we talk about Yaakov as a Sephirah, Yaakov as Tiferet, Yaakov as this harmonious reality. So we said last week that corresponds to the spine. We blew ourselves away last week talking about the sign bridging that gap between the physical and the spiritual. There's another fascinating aspect to this, because how many ribs extend from the spine? Start counting while I open a window. Those of you who are skinny enough to count.
4.
How many?
4 pairs.
I didn't hear.
4 pairs.
4 pairs. 4 pairs. No, more accurately, we have 12 ribs extending from the spine, which is cute. Is it cute? Is it a coincidence? Is there something deep? Is there something more deep and more meaningful? The rib cage, which protects the heart and the internal organs, perhaps that is all a physical manifestation of this idea. The idea of creating the 12 building blocks that are going to protect or become the Jewish nation. But not only that, they're going to become the protective source of life for the world. The Mishkan, which went through the middle of the desert, in the middle of the encampment, had the 12 tribes all around it, drawing their life from this center point, in the same way that our rib cage protects the center of our bodies from which we draw our lives. It's quite fascinating how deep and how interconnected this all goes. And the fact that it's all connected to bones, the fact that that is all connected to stones, just starts to show us how deep and how interesting this topic really gets. There's a fascinating additional piece to this, pun intended, an additional piece, which is that we're taught that Techiyat HaMeitim, resurrection of the dead, is going to start from bones. It's going to start from our bones, but not just any bone. There's a particular bone that, according to Chazal, will never break, will never decay, and from that bone is where the revivification, the resurrection of the dead is going to come about from. Does anyone know what that bone is called? It's called the Luz bone, and it is located, quite interestingly, at the top of the spine. This is the one bone that Chazal teach us is never going to break. Now, Luz is a fascinating concept as well, and it's a fascinating place. So much so that we... Oh, man. Look at that. That will blow you away once again. Anyway, moving on. So this place, Luz, is a fascinating place. It's a fascinating body part. It's the part that will never be destroyed, and it's the part that Chazal teach us bodies will be resurrected from. But there's also a place called Luz. And Luz is very famous because in Luz, it is impossible to die. This is what the Gemara tells us. Nobody would die in the city of Luz. So much so that it would take for people to think that their life was over, and then when they walked out of the city, they would die. So Luz is a fascinating place, and it's a fascinating concept, and it ties a lot of this up together. Not only is it fascinating for that reason, but it's fascinating to anybody who paid attention to the beginning of Parashat Vayeitze. Because if you check out, were you about to mention that, David?
Bethel, it was formerly known as Luz.
Oh, check it out, guys. You snooze, you lose. Chapter 28, verse 19. Vayikra et Shem hamakomahu Beit El. And he named that place Bet El. V'ulam Luz Shem ha'ir larishona. This place where Yaakov slept, this place where he had the dream, this place where he understood the reality of bridging the physical and the spiritual. It all happens in this place which used to be called Luz. It was the name of the place where he had his dream, which paralleled the spine, which was all about the Beit HaMikdash, as we talked about last week, which was all about the source of life, which was linked to Techiyat HaMeitim, to the resurrection of the dead, which is linked to the eternal side of Klal Yisrael, which is linked to the stones, which are going to become the stones of Klal Yisrael. It's all one big, juicy topic that just comes back on itself. So when we talk about the eternal building blocks, when we talk about building the Jewish people out of stones, we're referring to the building blocks of the Klal Yisrael. Yaakov taking us into this next phase of the book of Bereshit, taking us into the sprouting of Yaakov into the 12 tribes, where we become one klal, where we become one nation destined to go forward together. So that's where we see the concept of building the nation. The question we now have to face is, where do we see the concept of destroying it? But before we go there, do we have any comments or questions? In that case, let's all keep on going. So we've got our powerful concept of our avanim, of our continuous eternal elements representing Av and Ben, the father and the son. We've got Yaakov going out to build the foundation stones of the tribes. But as we know, things are not going to be so simple for him. There's one specific individual who makes it his business to complicate things as much as he possibly can for our dear friend Yaakov. And that is Lavan. He is the thorn in Yaakov's side, and he represents the challenge of building up Klal Yisrael. And he is the adversary, and he is the impediment, and he is the constant force to be reckoned with when it comes to creating our foundations, when it comes to creating our avanim. We might be familiar with this quote from the Haggadah. There comes a point in the Magid service where we encounter 4 verses. Now, these 4 verses, we're told we have to analyze them, we have to expound on them, we have to learn about them. It can be sometimes quite a tedious part of the Haggadah. But what's fascinating is that there are 4 verses which are taken from the book of Devarim. And in the context of that particular place in the book of Devarim, it is when Jewish people would go to the temple to be able to offer up their first fruits. The cream of the crop, so to speak, would be gathered together and taken in an elaborate procession to the Beit HaMikdash. And when they reach the Beit HaMikdash, they would have to recite 4 verses. And it's the same 4 verses that we say on Pesach night at the Seder table. And the first one is, bum, 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 right? Arami Oved Avi. An Aramean tried to destroy my father, tried to destroy my forefather. Vayered Mitzrayma, and he descended to Egypt, and he sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, strong, and numerous. That is our verse that we need to start with. That is what they would say when they brought bikurim, these first delicious cream of the crop fruits, to the Beit HaMikdash. The person would stand there holding his basket of fruit, and he would declare, Arami Oved Avi, that there was an Aramean who tried to uproot everything. And who was that person? Says Rashi, Lavan. This Aramean was Lavan. Lavan bikesh la'akor et hakol kasher adaf achar Yaakov. Lavan wished to exterminate the whole nation when he pursued Yaakov. Now, in the context of the Haggadah, in the context of our Pesach experience, Lavan is being contrasted against Paro, against Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh tried to kill all of the males. That was his big decree, that all of the male children have to be thrown into the river Nile. But Lavan is a guy who tried to exterminate the entire Jewish nation. Now, clearly, he was more than just a trickster, as he is referred to in different places, right? There is something that has very far-reaching implications in what Lavan is trying to do. If we consider, by going through our parasha, by going through Vayeitze, some of the trickery that he gets up to, that is somehow linked to wishing extermination, to wishing to destroy the entire Jewish nation. Now, in isolation, these things don't necessarily form that picture. If we take each of the things that he did, we might not think that it is particularly alluding to extermination. But as we start to build up the composition of what Lavan is attempting over here, a very interesting pattern seems to emerge. Right? We're familiar, for example, that one of the first things Lavan does is he switches Rachel for Leah. Yeah, Yaakov encounters Rachel, falls in love with her on the spot and wants to marry her, and Lavan pulls the wool over his eyes before pulling the wool over his eyes, pun intended, right? But he pulls the wool over his eyes and switches Leah into the chuppah at the very last moment, right? And that has an implication, and that has a repercussion, which is really quite beautifully referred to in a famous story in the Gemara. Now, I didn't even bother with the Hebrew on this one because the English story is just so long. This is a very famous story if you know it. If you don't know it, you're going to find out about it now. The story in the Gemara talks about the end of days when there's going to be this amazingly grand feast, which is going to be put on for all of the tzaddikim. And as with any good Suda, as with any good feast, you need to find someone who's going to lead the benching. Now, you've got all of the Avot and you've got all of the saintly people of our history, and they're all sitting there at the table, and they are having an argument about who is going to be worthy of leading the Zimun, who is going to be worthy of leading benching. So the Gemara tells us that they're going to come to Abraham. They're going to be like, okay, you're the first of our forefathers. Will you lead us in benching? And Abraham's going to turn around and say, I can't do it because I had Yishmael. Yishmael was evil and he came from me. I'm not worthy of leading the benching. So then they're going to go to Yitzchak and they're going to say, hey, Yitzchak, you lead the benching. And he's going to say, I'm not able to because I had Esav come from me. And then Yitzchak is going to say to Yaakov, come on, Yaakov, you do it. You're a big tzaddik. You lead the benching. And he's going to turn around and say, I can't because I married two sisters in their lifetime. And that was something which in the future is going to be forbidden. And so because of that, I am not qualified to be able to lead benching. And it goes on and on and on until eventually King David says, Kos Yeshuat Esau v'Shem Hashem Ekra. I'm going to be the one that's going to be able to lead the Zimun. I'm going to be the one that's able to lead the benching. But here's the thing, is that something about Lavan facilitating this situation is posing a problem for Yaakov. We're not going to be getting into tonight, the legitimacy or the appropriateness or whatever word you want to use about Yaakov marrying two sisters. Okay, we're not going to be getting into that tonight, but it's clearly a detriment. Otherwise, the Gemara wouldn't be telling us so. And it was Lavan who facilitated that situation. There's something that cuts straight to the core, to the point that it's on par with the emergence of Yishmael and the emergence of Esav. There's something that Lavan creates. There's a situation that Lavan creates. And when we start to go into it a little more, you see just how problematic it can actually be. You see, let's take a look at our text. Let's take a look at the situation that develops on account of marrying Leah and then subsequently marrying Rachel. You see, we can see at the top of the page over here, Yaakov first of all takes Leah, and he also, Lavan gives Zilpah as a maidservant, right? And then he has to go through the whole thing again of waiting for Rachel. Eventually, when he marries Rachel, he gets Rachel and he gets Bilhah, okay? And now look what starts to happen on account of this situation that Lavan has created. Verse 31, about a third of the way down the page. Hashem saw that Leah was unloved, so he opened her womb, and Rachel remained barren. Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called him Reuven. Why? Because Hashem has discerned my humiliation, for now my husband will love me. So we get the birth of Reuven in the first instance. That's all fine. We get the birth of Shimon, because Hashem has heard that I am unloved. So she names him Shimon. She names the third child Levi. She names the fourth child Yehudah. But we have to appreciate something here, guys. We have to appreciate that in verse 30, it told us that he loved Rachel more than Leah. There is an imbalance that exists between Yaakov and Rachel, and Yaakov and Leah. And that is a situation that has been created solely through the scheming of Lavan. Right? He works another 7 years for Rachel. Verse 31, God sees that Leah is hated, and as a response to that, Leah starts to produce children. We have to appreciate this is the first time that such a strong word is coming into the foray, is coming into prominence over here. Hashem notices that Yaakov hates Leah. The reality of sinah being brought into the world, and it's in the context of a husband and a wife. She produces children, but these children are coming about because Hashem is seeing and Hashem is hearing about her pain and suffering. Maybe now my husband will love me. God heard that I am hated. Maybe now my husband will escort me. That's with the birth of Levi. This time my husband will become attached to me because I've given him 3 sons. Right? And then we see at the end of this chapter, she stops giving birth. And then we switch focus to verse 1 of the next chapter. Rachel saw that she had not borne children to Jacob, so Rachel became jealous. Vatakane Rachel. We see an emergence now, not just of sin'ah, but we're seeing an emergence of kin'ah as well. Jealousy is coming into the mixture. Not only that, Vatome el Yaakov havali vanim vim ayin meta anochi. You have to give me children because otherwise I'm as good as dead. And what happens when she approaches him like this? The next verse, Vayichar af Yaakov barachel. Yaakov snaps back at his barren wife. She's on the verge of not wanting to live. She's experiencing pain and strife and jealousy and hatred, and he snaps back for not being able to produce children. Is it me who's causing all of this? So we have to understand that the source of all of this marital disharmony and the source of all of this pain and suffering is coming from Lavan. It comes from the fact that he choreographed the marriages of both of his daughters to Yaakov. The plan should have been so straightforward. Yaakov loved Leah. And that's not how the plan went about. That's not what ended up happening. Lavan orchestrates purposely an eventuality which creates all of this rivalry, which creates all of these problems, which creates all of this hatred and jealousy between 2 siblings. Now, we've seen throughout the book of Bereshit that sibling rivalry is a big problem. We've seen it with Cain and Abel. We've seen it with Yishmael. We've seen it with Esav. All of these siblings create tension and strife, and Lavan leans into this, and he sets Yaakov up for failure. He unites one person not only with 2 wives, but with 2 sisters. And this is already capable of spelling disaster, because if we fast forward all the way to the end of the Torah, to the book of Kitetse in the book of Devarim, where we're taught that a person who marries 2 wives runs the risk of having a loved wife or beloved wife and a hated wife. And what happens with the offspring of the hated wife? That's the famous episode, or the famous halachic section of the Ben Soreh Umoreh, the wayward and rebellious son. It's almost like he is purposely bringing these people together in the hope of creating disharmony, strife, misery, problematic children. He seems to be trying to plant all of that into the Jewish story, into these prototypes, into the Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim. Lavan is planting all of that, the jealousy, the hatred. None of that would have had to exist were it not for the fact that he brought about this situation, the marrying of two sisters. And by naming these children, the undertones of their names are hinting to the strife between Rachel and Leah, the hatred, the jealousy. It becomes embedded into the fabric of their children. It becomes embedded into their names. It becomes embedded into their essence. And because of that, Maseh Avot Siman Labanim, it will have to manifest itself within them as well. And this is all part of Lavan's calculation. It's interesting because the children don't really play a role in Parashat Vayeitze, right? There's basically no interaction amongst the children. They're born, and the next topic that we go to is the striped sheep, the spotted sheep, and all of the negotiations that Yaakov has to go into. But when we actually get into their story, when we actually start to experience the life story of the children, right, that's not until Yosef, until Joseph. That is where they start to interact with each other. That's where the seeds that were planted start to sprout. And the interaction of the children, once we get to Parashat Vayeshev, that tells us all we need to know, really. Once you get into chapter 37, I don't have it displayed on the screen for you, but if you've got a Tanakh in front of you, you'll see. You've got chapter 37, Jacob settles in the land of Canaan, and then we have the Toldot of Yaakov. We have Yosef, who was a shepherd with his brothers. And as we go through it, we see verse 3, chapter 37, verse 3, Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his sons. He made him the coat of many colors, as we describe it. And verse 4, his brothers, Vayiru Echav, ki oto ahav avihem mikol echav, they see that Yaakov loves Yosef more. Vayisneu oto, and they hated him for it. V'lo yachlu dabru l'shalom, they couldn't speak to him. And then Joseph goes and he has his dreams. 37 verse 5, Vayachalom Yosef chalom v'yaged le'echav v'yosifu od sno oto. He has this dream and he tells it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. Jump forward a couple of verses, verse 8. Vayomru lo echav hamalach timloch aleinu im nashol timshol banu vayasifu od sno oto. They hated him even more on account of his second dream. And then verse 11, you have, I really wish I'd managed to put this into the slides. It would have really painted the picture a bit better. But he dreams these two dreams, and the response of the brothers is, after being told that they are going to bow down to him, Vayikanu bo echav va'aviv shamar et hadavar. The brothers are jealous of him, and Yaakov kept the matter in mind. So Lavan has planted the seeds for sin'ah, of hatred. He's planted the seeds of kinah, of jealousy, by bringing about this interaction with Yaakov and his two wives, which are really two sisters, which is really a sibling rivalry. So Pharaoh had wanted all of the Jewish boys to be cast into the river, but Lavan wanted something far deeper than that. Lavan wanted to corrupt the Jewish people from the inside. And we know that the enemy from within is always more dangerous than the enemy without. And Lavan paves the way for us to be our own worst enemy. And we can fight through all of the oppressors throughout Jewish history. We can have Beit HaMikdash, and we can lose the Beit HaMikdash, and we can endure pogroms, and we can endure holocausts, and we can be really suppressed and pressed down, and our existence is threatened, and our existence gets uprooted. But what seems to linger after all of these physical, existential, outward, external threats, what remains is the most dangerous threat of all, and that is the jealousy and hatred within our own nation. Chazal tell us that the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of 3 averot, 3 sins, 3 transgressions, but we are still living in exile from the second destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which was caused by baseless hatred. We are still dealing with it thousands of years later. The residual effect of Lavan planting it into the Jewish story. The big 3 cost us 70 years of exile between the first Beit HaMikdash and the second, but baseless hatred has cost us over 2,000 years of exile. And the clear struggle is for us to understand and to connect with and understand the need to be compassionate, to simply not hate another Jew for being different, for not seeing this world the same way as me, for practicing differently to the way that I practice. To learn the lesson that we shouldn't look down on other Jews for the way that they look, or for the way that they daven, or for the fact they were born in a different location. That struggle keeps us apart today. And they are products of the rotten roots that were planted by Lavan in Parshat Vayeitze, which could uproot everything, which can ruin and spoil everything, and still creates problems for us today. The struggle of Jewish history, as embodied by the 12 children of Yaakov, on a level of Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim. What happens to the sons is a miniature of what we will go through. And the rest of the book of Bereshit, therefore, becomes this attempt, this effort for the tribes, for the brothers to overcome their jealousy, to overcome their hatred. And we have to constantly be revisiting the question of, are they going to be able to harmonize or not? Are they going to be able to come together and unite or not? Or are they always going to be this fractious, disparate group of people? And as is always the case, the end is hinted to at the very beginning. Because what we said is that these 12 Shvatim are represented, are embodied by the stones. And how many stones did Yaakov lay at the beginning of the evening? When he lay down to rest, he lay himself 12 stones around him. And then he lies down and he has a dream about the Beit HaMikdash. He has a dream about the world in a perfected state, about humanity in a perfect state. And when he wakes up, says the Pasuk, Vayashkem Yaakov baboker vayikach et ha'even asher sam meirashotav. He takes the stone that he had put under. He didn't put down a stone. He put down stones. And it's a midrash that teaches us that there were 12. But when he wakes up, they had merged together. Oh, I haven't got the verse for you on there. There we go. Right? When he wakes up in the morning, he finds one stone, et ha'even, under his head. They've merged together. And herein lies the secret. And herein lies everything that we are talking about. The journey that Bnei Yisrael need to accomplish in order to achieve Yaakov's vision of a perfect world, of perfect humanity. It's represented by the stones coming together. If we can learn to harmonize, if we can learn to unite and to unify and to get along, then we can have this amazing existence that Yaakov dreams about. The Beit HaMikdash, humanity in its perfected state, the world in its perfected state, the seamless unification of physicality and spirituality. But if we don't have that, then we have churban, we have chaos, we have sin'ah, we have kin'ah, we have hatred, we have jealousy, we have all of these rotten manifestations existing in our relationships. And so the rest of Bereshit sees the tensions between the banim, between the children, between the shvatim, between the tribes, between these avanim, the stones, the fundamental building blocks of our people, and seeing if they can actually achieve harmony or not. And that question, in a way, remains unanswered even to this day. Because Maaseh Avot Siman Banim, even though the brothers reached this point of unification by the end of the book of Bereshit, even though the stone under Yaakov's head alludes to the fact that we will reach that point, we haven't reached that point yet. It's a residual impact of Lavan trying to completely destroy and to corrupt from within the narrative of the Jewish people. So please God, we should reach that harmonious time. We should see the unification of our people. We should see the restoration of our Beit HaMikdash. We should see harmony achieved in our lifetimes. We should see all of these amazing perfected states come to being. And let us all say, Amen, Mazel Tov, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. We will take comments and questions on Zoom at the after party. But to all those watching on Facebook and YouTube, we wish you all a fantastic, a wonderful, and meaningful evening.